Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to my channel. Normally I don't buy into the whole trigger warning thing and all of that. I kind of feel like we're adults and you can see what a video is about, and if it's not for you, you can avoid. But the subject that I'm talking about today is child abuse, and it's child abuse so severe that it led to the death of a child. And it was such an incredibly troubling case. It really isn't for everyone. It is the kind of story that haunts you. I was first introduced to it 20, oh gosh, 25, almost 25 years ago. And I've never forgotten it. And you know, I still remember the names of key players, and it's a story that lingers. So if that's something that you don't think that you want to drag around with you, go ahead and flip on over to funny videos of cats or something. If you're sticking around, it is a tragic story, but it is also interesting, and one that I think poses a moral question at the end. So I'm going to start off by saying that if you want all of the details on this story is very easy to find on the internet, or if you're incredibly lucky, you may come across a copy of this book, Death from Child Abuse and No One Heard. So the book is, best I can tell, no longer in print, but you can easily find used copies of it on Amazon, and I've actually seen it several times in used bookstores. So let me see, you're not going to be able to see it too well, and there aren't a whole lot of pictures of her, but this cutie right here, this is Little Miss Ursula Sunshine Asade. Now, for people living in the central Florida area, particularly people that lived here in the 80s and 90s, may already be familiar with this case. This was a huge, huge story that really grabbed people's attention and stuck with them, and you'll find out why it stuck out so much in a minute. So I'm going to read the introduction page of the book because I think it really kind of set the story well. And this book hit close to home for me because a lot of the locations where this story took place, they're places I lived or live now. So it says, the body of 5-year-old Ursula Sunshine Asade was recovered from a shallow drainage pond in Altamont Springs, Florida on December 1st, 1982. She died at her home of the night of September 25th, 1982, following 2 months of continuous abuse, which ended in 55 hours of torture. On June 16, 1983, Susan Asade pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the death of her daughter and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. On November 4, 1983, Donald McDougal was sentenced to 34 years in prison for the second-degree murder conviction resulting from the brutal torture and abuse of Ursula Sunshine Asade. Ursula was described as a happy, bright child, full of life and a delight to be around. She was well-behaved, outgoing, and rarely got in trouble. She laughed a lot and was exceptionally friendly to almost everyone. She loved stuffed animals and had a bedroom full of them. She was a normal child who loved her mother and whose love and need for life was as great as any 5-year-old child. She changed during the month of August 1982. She became listless and quiet. She clung to her teacher's legs and refused to play at recess. She frequently complained of stomach aches. When asked why her stomach hurt, she said, "I think it's the soap I ate." There were 85 possible witnesses subpoenaed for Donald McDougal's trial. Ursula told others she was afraid to go home because of Don. She told others she was not allowed to have water and was eating soap instead of food. Ursula cried in pain, in horror, and in helplessness, and no one heard. We hear you, Ursula. This is your story. So starting off, Altamont Springs, where this little girl was killed, was an area that I lived in, and her tiny, abused body stayed hidden and rotting away in a duffel bag that had been weighted down and thrown in a retention pond. While the two people responsible for her death, her mother and her mother's boyfriend, fled the state. The second thing is 85 witnesses subpoenaed during his trial. 85 people who were aware of some level of abuse. This included neighbors who had seen the child standing under a tree in the backyard for hours in the Florida heat. Teachers who got strange notes from Ursula's mother, Susan, saying things like, she's on a special diet, don't give her anything to eat, and oh yeah, don't let her drink any water either. Friends of Donald's who had been to the house and heard him bragging about, look what kind of great control he had over this little bitch. This 5-year-old that he would make march for hours, saying her ABCs over and over again, beating her if she made a mistake. At night, while Donald and Susan slept, Ursula was forced to stand inside of a suitcase next to the bed, and Donald would set an alarm to wake up and make sure that she was still standing there. If she fell asleep or sat down, he would beat her. For the last couple weeks of her life, she was denied any food. She was forced to eat soap. Just soap. Until thick white foam poured out of her poor little body. And when the time came that Donald realized maybe he had taken things too far and told Susan, oh, make her something to eat, it was too late. The little girl was past saving, and she died in their home. And they put her in a duffel bag and tied some weights to it and threw her in a retention pond and left. Susan also became pregnant by Donald. And it was only when Donald left her that she finally went to local authorities and told them what had happened back in Florida. So they both came back to Florida and they were given their trials. And this is in regard to the sentencing. And again, I'm just going to read directly from the book. Donald McDougal was found guilty of second-degree murder and a lesser count of aggravated child abuse by a 12-member jury after they deliberated for 7 hours. The maximum sentence in Florida for aggravated child abuse was 5.5 years, but he was sentenced to double the maximum time for aggravated child abuse, equaling 11 years, and double the maximum time for second-degree murder. The worthless check convictions were 1 year each, making the maximum sentence 34 years. The judge went beyond the guidelines in the second-degree murder conviction for 4 reasons. 1, the defendant was particularly cruel to the victim and caused considerable pain and suffering, resulting in the death of the child. 2, the cruelty occurred over an extended period of time, and that involved planning and deliberation. 3, the child was particularly helpless because she was 5 years old and because her mother didn't intercede in the abuse. 4, McDougal was in charge of the child's discipline, and McDougal had a severe personality disorder. Donald McDougal was sentenced on November 4th, 1983, to 34 years at the Seminole County Correctional Facility in Sanford, Florida, another area I'm familiar with. He would be eligible for parole in 15 years. On February 12, 1985, the 5th District Court of Appeals upheld the guilty verdict and the 34-year prison sentence for Donald McDougal. Earlier, on March 24, 1983, Susan Assad pleaded guilty to the charge of manslaughter in the death of her daughter. Prior to sentencing, her lawyer told the court, quote, "Susan is not a monster and is not some socially deviant human being that lacks the capability to live in our society, but a victim as well." End of quote. He said that, quote, "In her relationships with men, she is totally submissive and did not understand the psychological domination and control can only cause pain and hardship. She didn't stop it from happening when she had the opportunity to do so." End of quote. Susan was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment, and she agreed to testify in the trial of Donald McDougal. She was denied parole in 1985, and she was released from the Broward Correctional Institution on July 14th, 1988. And for those of you keeping track, she served 5 pitiful years for allowing the torture and death of her daughter. Susan's Child by Don McDougal was born in 1983. It was ruled that Susan and the boy's father had permanently lost all rights to the child. The child was taken out of state, and the adoptive parents would never be allowed to find out the details of his background. The penalties for child abuse resulting in death were also tightened in the state of Florida. The assistant prosecutor at the McDougal trial, Donald Marblestone, led a public campaign for a first-degree murder penalty, which became a Florida state law in 1984. He said child abuse should have, quote, "the same penalty as if the victim's death were intended by the defendant." So this story really stuck out to a lot of Central Florida residents for a variety of reasons. One, the young age of the child. I mean, 5 years old, such a small, innocent creature to have gone through what she went through. Number two, when the details of the abuse and what was done to this girl came out, it really just stuck with people. It was impossible to forget. And then the incredibly disturbing fact that 85 people witnessed abuse. 85 people knew about something going on. Maybe they didn't know all the details, but they knew something, and not one of them ever picked up a phone and called the police. No one asked for help for this little girl. And if I'm not mistaken, at that point in time, teachers, at least in Florida, were not required by law to report abuse. And I believe that this case was part of what helped change that. Now, teachers are required by law to report any signs of abuse that they may see. And if that had been required back then, Ursula might still be alive. It is crazy for me to think about the fact that were she alive today, she'd be 2 years older than I am now. She'd be 42 years old. She'd probably be married, maybe have a few kids, possibly established in her career. And maybe she would have had some therapy to get past the trauma of her childhood, or maybe she would have gone on to have started some organization to help children that have suffered from abuse. We'll never know, because we only know 5-year-old Ursula. That's it. She's this forever. So there's an interesting PS to this story that didn't make its way into the book because of when it happened, although I believe there is a updated version that came out in 2002 that did cover this. But for those living in Central Florida, again, this helped the story stick. So September 25th, 1996, there was a local radio show, the Russ and Beau Show, and they were discussing the Ursula Sunshine Estate case. It was the 15th anniversary of the child's death, and news had just gotten out that the monster that murdered her, Donald McDougal, was actually going to be released from prison in April of 1997. So half of his sentence, and he was going to be set free. And Russ and Beau were talking about it on the show, like, you know, can you believe that this complete piece of shit is going to be a free man soon? This is disgusting. He should stay locked up forever. It was a big hot topic, tons of people calling in. And they started talking about how it ain't even gonna be safe if this guy gets out. He's gonna get lynched. You know, they were talking about all of the horrible things that could possibly happen to him, and making jokes about something bad happening to him in prison. And Russ even joked on the show, like, you know, I can see it now. This guy's gonna get killed tomorrow, and they're gonna be like, hey, y'all are getting charged. Callers were calling in, and just everybody really jumping on the bandwagon. There was one guy that was like, oh, don't you think you guys are going a little too far? And they're like, shut up. So anyway, the radio show got enough attention. There wasn't actually an inmate that called in. Now, by this point in time, Donald had been moved to Polk County, which is actually where I live now. He was moved to a prison in Polk County, and there was an inmate that called from the prison and told Russ and Beau, like, hey, you know, we're listening to the show, and a lot of us, we don't take kindly to what he did, and, you know, words getting around and whatever. So there was enough fuss at the prison that they decided to actually put Donald kind of into solitary, you know, to keep him safe. And it stayed that way for about a week. He was separated from the rest of the inmates, and then, you know, he's bored, whatever, and he says, hey, let me out of here, let me back out with everybody else. I want to be able to go outside, I want to be able to play basketball, whatever. And so they did, and 8 hours after letting him back out with the rest of the kids, he was beaten to death with a horseshoe stake. And that was October 1st, 1996. And sure enough, there was talk of the radio show and how it was believed that the show was a contributing factor to this. And, you know, should the host of the show face charges? But that was all basically brought to an end when the man that killed Donald, he just pled guilty. He didn't care. He was already in prison for like aggravated assault and things like that. But he was also HIV positive, and I think he decided he didn't have anything to lose. Didn't matter if they kept him in prison for the rest of his life, because the rest of his life wasn't going to be that long anyway. And despite what a lot of people thought, there was no bounty added on talked about on the radio shows. At one point in time, the claim was made that Russ and Beau were offering money, you know, like $1,000 or whatever to somebody that offed him, but there was no bounty on the show. However, after the fact, Ursula's biological father, who lived in another state and had not been around for anything, he did say that he just might give that inmate $1,000. And I don't think that ever came to pass. I don't think that would have been allowed to have happened, but I can certainly understand his feelings about it. So the moral question comes, is it okay that Donald McDougal was beaten to death in prison? Is it okay that his life ended when another inmate beat his head in with a horseshoe stake while about 100 other inmates stood around and watched. Is that murder? Or is it karma? I'd like to say that I had a good enough heart to say wrong is wrong, murder is murder, it's all wrong. But there's a part of me that finds almost this poetic justice that this man died with 100 people standing around who at any point in time could have tried to intervene, could have called for a guard, could have tried to stop it. Nobody did, and he died. Just like Ursula died because of the actions of one person and the inactions of 85 other people. So, what do you think? Murder? Poetic justice? Do we mourn the loss of this man? Or do we go, meh? Because I realize this isn't a very Christian attitude of me, but meh. Anyway, I'm curious to know what you guys think. Leave a comment below. Also, you know, look up the story. Find a copy of that book, or if you can't, you can at least, the story is all over the internet. You can find all of the sad, tragic details. But yeah, curious to know what you think. So leave a comment. Don't forget, like, subscribe, share, yada yada. And we'll see you guys next time. Rest in peace, Ursula.